All right, is that better? Okay, welcome to the latest dialogue on democracy. I'm David Barker. I am the director of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies here at AU, where our mission is to try to strengthen democracy through professional trainings, research, and public education. These dialogues are an important part of that mission because we get to talk to really smart people, thought leaders across industry and in politics and academia and journalism, and in other words, to help us understand, right, the myriad threats and challenges that our democracy faces, and hopefully give us some ideas about how to address some of those. We're very, very pleased, of course, to be co-sponsoring this event, as we so often do, with the Kennedy Political Union. And as always, we are very grateful to Jim and Claudia Thurber, whose vision and generosity have been able to make these dialogues possible, which is why they are in fact called the Thurber Dialogues in Democracy. So tonight we are more than fortunate to get to talk to Dr. Theodore Roosevelt Johnson. Dr. Johnson, or Ted, is a senior advisor at New America, where he leads its flagship Us at 250 initiative, marking the nation's semi-quincentennial. I had to practice that word a couple of times. Ted is also a columnist at the Washington Post, where you may have seen his column. Prior to joining New America, he was a senior fellow and director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law, where he undertook research on race, politics, and American identity. He is also a retired commander in the U.S. Navy, serving for 20 years in a variety of positions, including as a White House Fellow in the first Obama administration and as a speechwriter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Math from Hampton University, a master's degree in international relations from Harvard, and a doctorate in law and policy from Northeastern. Okay, so here's how things are going to go. And Ted, why don't you come on up? All right, yeah. By the way, my son is also a Theodore. Oh, very good. But his middle name's not Roosevelt, though. But, so for those of you who have been here before, you know how this goes. I am going to interview or have a conversation with Ted for the next 40 minutes or so, at which time we will open things up to all of you to be able to ask questions. And I'm very pleased to see so many of my students here. We especially encourage questions from students, so think about it and be ready, just like class. No pressure. All right. So, kicking things off, Ted. In a recent piece for the Washington Post, you told the story of Crystal Mason. And I'm wondering if you could repeat that story here and talk a little bit about what it means for voting rights and where things stand in the U.S. now.
Yeah, sure. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the Thurbers for doing this. So much to say. And I was telling David before, I have the sometimes I can go on a bit long. I'm a bit of a storyteller, so redirect me if I get lost here. But so Crystal Mason, what an incredible story, rather commentary on the state of American democracy. Crystal Mason, a Black woman in Texas, was a tax preparer years ago, and she basically helped her clients get more money than they deserved by fabricating tax returns. And so she ended up defrauding the government out of about $1.5 million. She was caught, sentenced to 5 years in prison in the state of Texas. She does her time. She's released in the year of 2016. And her mother says, look, you're out of jail. You're getting back on your feet. You're working. I think she was in school to get a certification of some sort. And she had 2 small children. So her mother said, look, you're back in society now. It's time to do your part. And that includes voting. And so Crystal Mason, heeding her mother's advice and encouragement, goes to the local precinct to vote. Her name is not on the rolls. So she shows her, and she has to show her ID in Texas. ID is required. She shows her driver's license. They don't see her name. Someone helps her fill out a provisional ballot and says, okay, well, submit this, but you'll have to go back with and file with the government, show that you're registered to vote, that everything's above board. And she doesn't, but the casting of the provisional ballot was sufficient enough to get her in trouble, because when she was released from prison, she was still on supervised release. And in the state of Texas, until you complete all of your sentence, not just the time behind bars, but supervised release, probation, all of those things, you're not eligible to vote. She didn't know that. Right, right. And even though, they say, look, it says on the form, in the fine print, if you're on supervised release, rather, you're not allowed to vote. The person who helped her was a trained poll person at the site there. That person, not seeing her name on the rolls, still helped her to vote. Long story short, they came after her and sentenced her to 5 years in prison for voter fraud, for casting a vote when she wasn't allowed to. She was immediately put back in jail for not for the voting violation, but for violating her parole or her supervised release by committing a crime before the supervised release had happened. So she was back in jail, I think, for 7 or 8 months. And then once that time was served, she was, and her voting rights case was on appeal, she was allowed to go back home. So she's been home for 5 years, and her case is still open on appeal in the state of Texas. The latest news is that in the actually, I think it's early this year, maybe by summer, we'll know whether or not she will go back to jail for 5 more years, or if they will determine to move on. I tell her story, and I wrote about this in the Post, because it matters what we think of Crystal Mason. If you think of the history of the United States, the 3 people that have been restricted from our democracy the most: Black folks, women, and those who have been incarcerated. It took a 15th Amendment to get Black men anyway in. And then decades later, it took the 19th Amendment to finally allow women to vote just 100 years ago. And depending on what state you live in, if you are in prison, you can vote, or if you are in prison, you cannot vote until the governor pardons you after your release. Every state is just a little bit different. In Maine and New Hampshire, I think it is, people in jail can vote from jail. But in the state of Florida, state of Virginia, if you've been convicted of a felony, the only way your voting rights can be restored is if the governor pardons you by name. And if you've cleared all of your fines and fees, that can be hard to determine. So what we do with Crystal Mason tells us about the kind of democracy we want to have in this country. If we make a villain out of her, we are saying that that voting is essentially a privilege, and that the laws will determine who can participate freely, who it will be easy for, and who it will be more complicated for. Or we can choose to have a democracy where we err on the side of access. A lot of research has shown that voter fraud is about someone successfully casting a vote twice. Is just as likely as that person being hit by a meteor or being struck by lightning. It's extremely rare for a vote to be successfully cast twice and counted. So voter fraud is not really a problem in these United States. So to send her back to jail for 5 years for an error, instead of saying, we know the laws are confusing, your vote was never counted, and so let this be a lesson to you that these are the rules. We'll see you in a few years, or a year or so, whenever you can vote. It matters what we do with Crystal Mason, and though it will be a commentary on the state of Texas in particular, I think it is a national commentary in the sense that you cross state lines, and in one place you're a voter, and in the next place you're headed back to jail. And I don't know that kind of mismatch is what we had in mind, or even the founders, what they had in mind with the elections clause, and sort of trying to provide some sort of standard baseline of who can vote, how to vote, and then the control that the states have over the process.
It seems to me like she might have just had the wrong clients, the wrong tax clients.
Right.
Different clients might have had a different outcome.
Well, yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so you've also written in the New York Times about your conservative father, and about the personal conservatism of the Black church, and as well as the history of self-determination messages by the likes of Booker T. Washington and Malcolm X, and in general about the substantial ideological diversity that exists in the African American community. Meanwhile, though, right, maybe paradoxically, maybe not, as we all know, about 9 in 10 African Americans vote routinely for Democrats at the polls. Some observers or commentators on the right have characterized uh, that voting pattern as a form of blind allegiance or as even control on the part of the Democratic Party. Um, you've offered a different take, so I'd like to hear that.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so let's do a sweep through history super quick. Okay, so there's a civil war, and after the Civil War, we get the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment that creates birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment that says that the right to vote cannot be infringed upon on the basis of race, color, that sort of thing. All right, and so now you have black men that are able to vote. You have a Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, that wanted black folks to vote, and you have a Democratic Party that essentially became the party of white segregationists, white populists that were not so keen on the idea, mostly in the former Confederate states. So, and here's the reason why this is so important. After, and maybe we'll talk about this in like the Three-Fifths Compromise sort of stuff, but the goal, the 15th Amendment had to happen because the Three-Fifths Compromise was written in a way that a state with a large black population could only count 3/5 of the population to determine how many representatives it would get in Congress. And so the pro-slavery states wanted 5/5 to be counted. They wanted every enslaved person to be counted because it increased their congressional representation. Those who were anti-slavery abolitionists didn't want black folks to count at all. That disempowers the southern states because it basically eradicates a large part of their population. And so when the 14th Amendment undoes the 14th, or the 14th Amendment undoes the Three-Fifths Compromise, right? The 15th Amendment now empowers the black men in those former slavery states to be part of democracy. That has to happen to ensure that the former Confederates don't try to roll back all the gains from the Civil War. All right, so as soon as black folks can vote, as soon as black men can vote, they are already voting 90+% for Republicans. And this continues throughout for the rest of the 19th century until the black codes come into place. Reconstruction is rolled back after the Compromise 1877, and Jim Crow laws and grandfather clauses and literacy tests and poll taxes, all these things essentially remove the black folks from the electorate that the 15th Amendment invited in. Okay, and so from the very beginning, black folks have always voted as a bloc because from the very beginning, since 1870, the ratification of the 15th Amendment, there has been a party that was pro-civil rights and a party that was not. And so the choice, all of the political diversity that exists among Black America, muted because of the one prevailing question: can we be citizens? Can we participate in this democracy? Will our rights be protected by the government? And there was a party that said, yes, government should do more, and a party that says federal government should have no role, and states should dominate. So the electoral uniformity that we see among Black folks today since 1964, about 88 to 90% of Black folks on average vote for the Democratic candidate in both presidential and congressional elections. And it has been so steady because there is a party that is seen to be pro-civil rights in the Democratic Party today, and a party that is seen to be at worst anti-civil rights, at best status quo, and maybe roll it back in favor of individualism or self-determination. So the monolith that we see in the Black electorate is a function of our two-party politics and the divisive, not a reflection of a sort of uniform set of views among Black Americans on any range of policies. If you ask Black folks about immigration, energy, small business, national security, you name it, you will find the same diversity of views among that group as you would find anywhere else in the country. But the difference is, whereas Black conservatives are voting for Democrats because of the civil rights question, white conservatives are mostly Republicans. And that divide has made it seem, or at least the shortcut is the sort of heuristic, is that because Black folks vote for Democrats, they must be progressive. And because the Democratic Party is moving left over the last couple of decades, that must be because the Democrats' base is pushing them left. When in fact, Black folks, last numbers I've seen, about 1 in 5 identify as conservative, about 45% identify as moderate, and then about a quarter or so identify as progressive. So that sounds like America to me. But that group that then goes to elections and votes 90% for Democrats on the race question. And so that we don't get to enjoy the beauty of political diversity in Black America because of the hyperpartisanship, toxic polarization, and how central race has remained since the beginning to who gets to participate in this democracy.
Thanks. And so following up on that, perhaps even more paradoxically, right, in recent years, it appears that the monolithic Black electorate to which we were just talking about may in fact be ebbing a little bit. And when it comes to other people of color, the huge advantage that Democrats had amassed as recently as 2016 has definitely dissipated a lot. This appears especially true among young men. So why is that, do you think? And what does that portend for democracy? Is obviously Democrats don't like it, right? But would you say in the bigger picture that if we have two parties actually competing for the votes of these folks, that's better for democracy? Or in this particular case, would you say maybe the opposite?
So there's two framings that work here. The first one, and this is the one I think we're seeing most in the media, that in the last 8 years, no, scratch that, in the last decade and a half, Republicans have doubled their support among Black Americans in presidential elections. That is a true statement. And it is also true that that has happened with Donald Trump as either the nominee who wins, the president who loses, or the presumptive nominee now who we'll see what happens. And so the thinking is, wow, there must be something about Trumpism that is attracting all of these Black folks and Hispanic folks and even Asian American folks, because the numbers have been ticking up over the last decade and a half. That's all real stuff, real data. Here's the other side of the story. In 2008, when Obama runs against McCain gets 4% of the Black vote. That is the lowest percentage of the Black vote that a Republican incumbent or nominee has gotten since 1964, when Goldwater came out against the Civil Rights Act of 64 and Johnson gets 4% of the Black vote. 4% of the Black vote, by the way, before the Voting Rights Act of 65. So we're talking about a very, very small swath of Black voters relative to the total population. And so between 1964 and 2004, Republicans, 68 to 2004, Republicans averaged about 11.5% of the Black vote. And then in 2008, they get 4% of the Black vote. In 2012, Romney gets about 6-7% of the Black vote. In 2016, Donald Trump gets about 6-7% of the Black vote. And then in 2016, he gets 8% of the Black vote. 2016, 8% is double the 2008 4%, but it is a third lower than the historical average for Republican presidents and candidates from 68 to 2004. So the anomaly here isn't that Trump is doing something different to attract more voters of color. It's that Obama was the anomaly. He was the one that either voters of color didn't want to vote against, or they sat elections out in order not to vote against them, or they didn't like Republican candidates, whatever the case may be. And now they have re-entered their sort of standard voting patterns post-Obama that are still a third lower than the average for 4 decades. So it is true that Black support for Republicans has doubled in the last, since 2008. It is also true that they're far below their historical average. So that's how I explain why we are seeing more Black men in particular vote for Republicans now. Hispanic men and frankly, even more Hispanic women than Black women are sort of returning to the Republican Party. But as far as it concerns Black voters, you're going to get about 1 in 10 that are going to vote for Republican candidates, period. Some states have done better. I think Chris Christie, when he was governor of New Jersey, got up to 20%. Some unreliable polls, but polls nonetheless suggested Mike Huckabee in Arkansas got 40% of the black vote when he was running for re-election. Larry Hogan in Maryland, 30% of the black vote when he last ran for re-election against a black candidate who was the former head of the NAACP. Larry Hogan does 30% against that guy because he was too progressive for most of Black America and most of Black Marylander, or a third of Black Marylanders anyway. And Larry Hogan was pro-school choice, which is a Republican sort of policy position that is attractive to a lot of Black families who don't trust the school system to treat their children fairly or to keep their kids out of the sort of the discipline of the behavioral uh, penalty part of that school, sort of the school to prison pipeline that scholars have written about. So it's in historical context, what's happening now is not that remarkable. Shorter term, it is notable that post-Obama Republicans have been able to recoup some of that support, and we'll see what happens this year. If the polls are, if the favorability polls are to be believed, it could be that they reach that 10, 11%. Republicans get 10, 11% of Black voters this fall, which could be the decisive set of votes in some key states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and maybe even Georgia.
Thanks. So many political observers, and including you and me, have bemoaned the growth in political polarization and the lack of compromise in the U.S. But you've also pointed out, and you referenced this a second ago, that in the first century in American politics, the word compromise, whether we're talking about the Three-Fifths, the Missouri, 1850, 1877, was often a euphemism for taking natural and constitutional rights away from people. Uh, so more generally, the supposedly halcyon days of a half century ago, when Democrats and Republicans routinely crossed the aisle and worked together, reflected a time when just about everybody in elective office looked like me, um, and when compromises were enabled by denying equal rights to people as well. So I have two questions for you. Number one, is our polarized era actually a sign of national progress in some respects in terms of reckoning with our foundational, national paradox or sin? Or does it simply mean that democracy is really difficult under any circumstances, but when democracy includes this much diversity, maybe it becomes almost impossible?
Yeah, another great question. And I'm gonna try again to start at the beginning and then get to the point. So again, if I get lost, push me back. So the country some of the data is a little bit disputed, but folks like Jill Lepore and others have said that in the first presidential election, 1789, 1790, only 6% of the people in the United States were eligible to participate because of you had to be white, you had to be male, you had to mostly be propertied. In some states, you had to be Christian. So it was just like very quickly narrowed down who gets to participate in democracy. We in 2026, we'll celebrate our 250th anniversary of independence, ratification of the Declaration, and we will say that we are the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. And in this constitutional democracy on day one, only 6% of the people in the country were able to participate. That's democracy. We call that democracy because they had to vote. But is that, what kind of democracy is that? Of the 6% that could, only half did. So our first president was chosen by 3% of the population. That doesn't sound like democracy anymore. That doesn't even sound like a republic, to be honest with you. That sounds very much like an oligarchy of sorts of people of like a sort of papal convention. People go into a dark room and then you see the smoke. Oh, congratulations, we have a president, and here we are. That's kind of what brought Washington into power. And every major fight we've had in this country has been over the expansion of democracy and, of course, the sort of distribution of resources. The economy and democracy are the two things. And so if, we have what, 4 or 5 constitutional amendments around voting. 18th, 19th, the one around poll taxes, one around voting to slavery states and those that were not. And so every time the nation expands, the Louisiana Purchase or the Missouri Compromise, it's okay. Even when we brought in like Hawaii and Alaska, we have to bring in one that's going to help one party and one that's going to help the other party. We have to have the one set of states that are going to come in and help the anti-slavery faction, the northern states, and then another state that comes in to keep the balance that will be slavery. And so even how we decided to grow, we parsed up the growth based on who participates in democracy, and often race was at the center of that question. And not just about Black folks. You know, the 14th and 15th Amendments also enfranchised a lot of white immigrants. They also enfranchised folks that didn't have meet the property requirements or the tax requirements. Ben Franklin said that if a man has a donkey and because he has property, he's able to vote, and then the donkey dies and now he has no property and can't vote, who has the right, the man or the donkey? And so this is sort of the open question. Do we really grant voting rights to people? Or do we grant voting rights to blocks based on their partisan affiliations or political behaviors, and then justify the exclusion and the inclusion based on a set of economic factors, or in the case of Black folks, based on a set of stereotypes or perceptions about intellect, culture, biology, these sorts of things. I guess the last thing I'll say on this, and then we can sort of jump into each compromise if you want to, or just sort of just accept the fact that, you know, maybe we'll talk about one of them, but um, scholars have said that racist policies come from racist ideas and not the other way around. And so it's easier to think, well, the framers, you know, they were hypocrites. Some of them were slave owners, and so they said all this stuff about equality and democracy, but they didn't mean it. And they often said, yeah, we know the Black man is not really going to be on par with us. We don't really think they're equals. It looks bad for us to say that we believe in equality and we're enslaving people in the process. And so it wasn't that hatred crafted policies to oppress people. It was that, in my view and a view of other scholars, that slavery was critical to a large part of the nation's economy. And we had to come up with justification. And the other thing about this is that an agrarian economy takes a lot of labor. And if you pay people fair wages, you don't make a lot of money doing, you know, tobacco and cotton. And so a free labor force in a new country was required to make the thing profitable. And then once the profits start rolling in, and then the people also become profitable by having babies, by, you know, getting older, it becomes its own business. And so now you have to justify why you exclude these folks. Initially, it was, well, they're not Christians. And so because they're not Christians, this is acceptable for us to put them in indentured servitude or enslavement. And then they started converting to Christianity. So now you need a new excuse. Well, they're not smart enough. Look at how they behave. They don't conform. They haven't assimilated to the American way of life. And so now all of these racist ideas begin to be justification for a democratic and economic set of policies. And so then when you fast forward, even post-Civil War, where, you know, millions of casualties and between injuries and deaths in the Civil War, 3 immediate constitutional amendments, and within a decade, you get the Compromise of 1877, where the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, has lost the popular vote. He is not winning in the Electoral College. He's losing to the Democrat Samuel Tilden. Tilden is from New York. Hayes is from Ohio. And there are 19 Electoral College votes that are disputed. And who decides who gets those votes? Well, the Republicans send their team into a room with Democrats, and they go literally into a hotel room a block from the White House and parse up these contested electoral votes and decide, here's the deal that's made. It's the Compromise of 1877. The 19 votes in dispute are given to Hayes in exchange for relaxing federal troop protections of Black folks in the former Confederate states. And the sort of states' rights crowd in the South took the deal. You can have the White House as long as you get out of our capitals. And that immediately begins the rollback of Reconstruction. And then within, again, a decade or two, you've got Black folks on the, you know, participation rates in the late 1860s at the state level, and then post 1870 nationally, in states like Mississippi, Louisiana, 60, 70% turnout among Black folks. You have the first Black senators, your first Black folks in the House of Representatives. And after two senators by, I think, 1880, 1890, there's not another Black senator until the late 1960s, 1970s with Ed Brooke, because of the disenfranchisement of Black voters that happens in exchange for the keys to the White House in the Compromise of 1877. So that those little stories suggest the role that race plays in our democracy, the role that class plays, and then the way power is willing to barter away rights that are supposed to be constitutional and justify that infringement, and by protecting democracy or keeping those in power comfortable.
So we should be careful about how much we celebrate compromise and how much we
Or
lament
which ones we
polarization.
right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So like maybe three more questions. So you're a long-serving military officer and a veteran, as we've discussed. And you've also, not surprisingly, then just described yourself as patriotic. In your book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, you argue that a blueprint for national solidarity can be found in the exceptional citizenship long practiced in Black America. What is that blueprint?
Yeah, so it's more of so Martin Luther King provides a blueprint for how to get stuff done, but all of us can't be him, and all of us, if it ends up the same way as him, a lot of us would never want to be him, even if the good would come after our deaths. And so by saying it's a model, I'm just saying that the demand for progress and the sacrifice that led to progress should inspire us, and I absolutely believe Black patriotism, along with the patriotism of Irish immigrants that came over and like you name it, we all have a story to tell. For Black folks, every war this nation has fought since its inception, Revolutionary War on, Black people have fought in those wars. In the first book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, I tell the story of Jehu Grant, who is this enslaved man in Rhode Island, and he's working for a plantation owner who was loyal to the Brits. This owner basically grows, like, he raises cattle and grows crops and then sells that stuff to the Brits who are off the shore of Rhode Island, to give them the meat and the grains and that sort of thing. Jehu Grant is this enslaved man's name at this plantation, and he fears that not only will his owner send over cattle, but also send over enslaved people to fight for the Brits to defeat the revolution so that people like him can maintain their good business contracts and standing. And so Jehu runs away, and he runs to Connecticut, joins the Continental Army, and serves there for 9 months, serves first in Connecticut and then in upstate New York, until 10 months after he joins the Army. The guy that owned him in Rhode Island shows up in New York and says to the Army, "You've got my property and I want it back." And the Army returns him. And Jehu Grant returns to slavery after fighting for 9, 10 months, and eventually is sold to a man who allows him to work his price off, and eventually buys his freedom when he was in his 60s or 70s or something like that. Around this time, Andrew Jackson is president and does the first major thing for veterans, which is to provide pensions for veterans who fought in the Revolutionary War. Prorated amounts, if you serve 2 years or more, full pay, and then from 6 months to 2 years, prorated. Well, Jehu did 10 months. He deserves some money, so he petitions for his pension, and the government writes back and says, services rendered while a fugitive from your master are not recognized. So he gets no pension, he dies blind and indigent, and lost to history. And yet, he says, he apologizes to the government after he receives a rejection letter and says, "I'm sorry, look, I know when I ran away, that was wrong. I promise you that I paid my way, I earned my freedom, and I fought for the country, and I couldn't help but fight because the fight for independence was too important to me as an enslaved man to sit it out. And so I wanted to be a part of it as well." This is a story for Black folks that fought in the War of 1812, and we can go from the Civil War to World War I and II, where they're cut out of the GI Bill mostly. And yet, every time we have a war, Black folks show up and vote. After white men, the highest enlistment rate demographically in the country, Black women today, Black women in the Army. And so Black folks have never abandoned the responsibility of citizens to fight for the country, and yet the sort of trickling down of democracy to them has gone more slowly than then maybe the Native Americans have a better claim, but it's gone pretty slowly to reach us. And so what does that what is that? What is that? What kind of patriotism shows up for every fight and then returns to servitude or subjection after the fight, just to show up the next time the country calls again? And I think it's best captured in a letter to the editor written in the wake of World War II by a Black cafeteria worker in Kansas who was about to be drafted. And he writes a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, which is a national but African-American owned newspaper. And he says, look, why should we go overseas to fight for democracy when we don't get it here? And so he said, I'm calling for a double V campaign, double victory. Victory for democracy abroad and victory for democracy at home. And to me, that describes Black patriotism. It is the fight for democracy to protect it, both its existence in the States as it is in order to improve it, as well as the fight for it overseas, but also not just to further the nation's fight for democracy, but also to make a claim on access to democracy domestically. And so our fighting in wars is just as much about trying to protect the country as it is a claim on our place in it. The last thing I'll say is that other nations have used this against us. In the military, I was a signals intelligence officer, which sort of bled into some cyber stuff and information operations. And there's a little corner of what used to be called psychological operations. And in World War I, II, Korea, and Vietnam, all of the nations we were fighting would drop leaflets over segregated troops, or predominantly, troops that were integrated, but predominantly Black, saying, why are you over here fighting us when they're at home killing? Who's protecting your wife and children? You're over here trying to take us out, and they're at home taking y'all out. And then at the same time, especially in Korea and World War II, they would drop pamphlets over white troops and say, while you're out here fighting us, those lazy Black dudes are back home beating and raping your wives. They have your jobs. They're taking advantage of them. And it was graphic. There's one from Germany in World War II that was, I'm Gen X, so this may be telling my age a little bit, but there used to be collector's cards where when you turn them, this picture turns in the light. The Germans had a version of that leaflets they dropped over segregated troops in World War II, that when you turned it one way, it looks like a barren wasteland. And when you turn it another way, it looks like a Black man raping a white woman, based on the way it's like a tree in a bush and sort of one look, and then this very aggressive act of sexual violence in another. This is what's happening to your wives while you're over here fighting us. Maybe you're fighting the wrong thing. So our racial tensions, our racial history is a national weakness. And the last thing I'll say, I promise, and I'll be quiet on this, is that we saw this in 2016 when all of the data is out from Britain and other places that the Russians used false advertising on places like Twitter and Facebook to convince white folks that Black people have guns and they're coming to your neighborhoods. And then to Black audiences, they convinced them that nobody cares about this election. It's going to be stolen. Find other ways to spend your time on election day. Your vote doesn't count. And the target was specific to racial groups, and it was essentially a digital version of the leaflets that we saw a century ago. So the tactics are not old. Russia said after World War II, when we were fighting for democracy and the Soviets are fighting for communism, and we would get on a high horse about how democracy is superior, the Russians would say, and you lynch Negroes. That's the rebuttal to this democracy, this freedom that you're talking about. You're killing your own people who fought for the country, and that sort of hypocrisy is weaponized by nations in every conflict we have, and in our elections as well.
Wow. So I have two more for you, and we have about 10 minutes before we open it up. All right. No, you're doing great. So another thing you've said is that to find what society and our American democracy needs, one needs to look no further than to the sidelines of little kids' soccer games. What's that all about?
Yeah, and so look, I've been part of institutions. I spent a year as a White House fellow, so I've been in the Roosevelt Room when they're having meetings. I literally in 18, I believe it was, one day was with Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Dick Durbin talking about criminal justice reform, and the next day with Jared Kushner in the Roosevelt Room talking about criminal justice reform. It became the First Step Act. So I've seen that side of the work, and it's so important. But sort of following on from everything I've said here, if you fix institutions, if you ratify constitutional amendments, if you pass laws, if they're implemented poorly or not at all, then they kind of didn't happen a little bit. And so I'm pushing not to take the focus off of law and policy and institutions and structural change, but also to suggest that if we don't have a culture of democracy, a kind of civic culture of democracy, then we can literally pass constitutional amendments and then within a decade undermine them because we don't agree with them. And so this sort of the sidelines of the little kid soccer piece was talking about the team parent. And not teen parents, which are actually not very good piece. Like I had little kids that are older now, but the sidelines can be there are a lot of parents who think their kids are like the next LeBron or Michael Jordan or Walter Payton or someone. So they tend to, even with their 7-year-olds, they tend to think, hey, coach, why is my kid playing more? But the team parent is the one to make sure the parents have the right jerseys for their 6-year-old at the soccer practice, that who's bringing the Capri Suns and the orange slices and who's responsible for the after game snacks and communicating practice times. That person, for no pay, for only to make sure the little unit, that little society works well, is an indispensable entity when it comes to soccer, more than the coach, I think, and certainly more than sort of the sideline parent. And so where are the team parents in our society, the folks that are the exemplars, that are modeling what it feels like to be inclusive, to be fair, to be communicative, to tamp down issues when they arise? Where are those folks? And we have become a society where our heroes are more and more nationalized, and less do we recognize the people around us that are doing the day-to-day hero work. I think the future of our country, to the extent our democracy improves, it will be because the green shoots of our democracy are found in the people that are leading at the local level, far more than having a transformational national figure that's suddenly going to be loved so much that 80% of the country is going to decide, I'm with that guy or I'm with that gal, and let's make our democracy stronger because we love this person so much. When we are, to the polarization question, we are further away from recognizing that person. And what sociologists have suggested is that the future heroes are not coming from the place that they traditionally came from, military service, being great politicians, or that sort of thing. They're now celebrity, because our system doesn't allow for errors. Errors now become a way to tear down the competition. Celebrities get famous by making mistakes. And so it almost becomes the the thing that makes them attractive, and you can't hurt them. Like, what are you going to, we saw this with Donald Trump. He said a lot of stuff that would have gotten folks disqualified a few years ago, and he won the presidency. So if we have a sort of national system where heroes arise from celebrity, from name recognition, and then a local system that doesn't recognize the beauty of that team parent, just making sure we're operating well, I do not think we're on the path for a stronger democracy. I think we're on path for a more commoditized and divisive one, rather than one that's more inclusive and meant to do what the Declaration says, which is demand that government use its powers only as the consent of the governed allow.
Thanks. And throughout the second half of your answer, I just kept asking myself, are Capri Suns still a thing?
I don't know. I'm dating myself.
Okay, I wasn't sure. All right. As I'm with you. All right.
Are they Yetis now? Does it, like, little kids get Yetis with juice in it?
Last question. So, what is the Us at 250 initiative?
Yeah, so Us at 250 is so Anne Marie Slaughter, who runs New America, she grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and was 10 years old when the bicentennial happened in 1976, and had just such fond memories of the time. And in 2026, we turned 250, as I mentioned earlier. And so maybe 5-6 years ago, she started talking to folks about, what can we do? How can we leverage this moment in the country as an inflection point, to make it more than just fireworks and hot dogs? And so when they sort of devised this concept, and she called me up and said, "Hey, are you interested?" And I said, "Yes, count me in." What it is it's a way to use this semi-quincentennial to think about who we are, where we've come from, and who we aspire to be. And so the first thing we've done is created a framework for how to talk about the country in this moment of pride, reckoning, and aspiration. Pride in the nation's progress. I say almost everywhere I go now, I'm much happier being Black in 2024 than 1824. That is a reason to celebrate. I don't care what you say about America today. It is better than it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. We should celebrate that progress because it wasn't a gift. Like I said, a lot of Black folks died or returned to slavery for this gift. A lot of women who couldn't served in other ways as spies, as nurses for this gift. So we should celebrate that progress. The second is reckoning, which suggests that there has been a gap, and there remains a gap between who we say we are and who we actually are, who we aspire to be, and then how we've behaved. And we need to reckon with that shortfall. And then the third is aspiration. If we are trying to build very different countries, it doesn't matter if we're optimistic because we're working across purposes. And so aspiring to a shared sense of purpose for the country is what this moment can bring. So that's the narrative framework where we've created a fellowship. This year, we brought on 17 fellows who are doing work at the local level through nonprofits, bringing people together across difference in a range of ways, everything from a white woman in upstate Albany, New York, who's a Presbyterian minister who does things like invites the community to her church for campfire stories or potlucks with folks from who have immigrated there, as well as folks that have been there forever, and like a Chicano spoken word poet in rural Colorado that has a vision for what America could look like that doesn't usually include rural people of color who are artists, and everything in between, sculpturists and poets and podcasters, the whole nine. This coming year, we're looking for local journalists who are telling these kinds of stories. But the goal is to suggest that I know we're divided right now. I know polarization is at a high point, but there are beautiful people doing incredible things everywhere, and who is telling their stories. And we want to highlight those people and their stories and their work for the semi-quincentennial to say that Obama had this famous line of, you are the people you were looking for, which kind of sounded like a little bit of a cop-out because the hope and change thing from 2008 was like, hey, man, you're the guy that's going to deliver it. But no, no, it is up to us. He was never going to be the guy. He may be the symbol, maybe a messenger of sorts, maybe a smart, astute politician, but he was never going to be the guy that delivered the America he talked about in his 2004 DNC speech about, no red or blue, just the United States. That was always going to be up to us, always. And so for me, us at 250 is a reminder that this country is going to go as we go, period. And if we don't like what's happening in the country, we can either hold our nose and just, choose the lesser of two evils, or we can get behind folks that are trying to make it better, stronger, more inclusive, to finally live up to this idea that we can be egalitarian, multiracial, without promising everyone gets the same stuff, no matter how much skin they have in the game, and sort of stay true to the individualist self-determination sort of streak of Americanism that I don't think most Americans want to get rid of. They just want it to be respected more and not be, stratified based on where you fall out in the hierarchy.
All right, great stuff. Thank you so much. All right, now it's up to you guys. I'm not clapping yet. Hey, good to see you. So who's got the next question for Ted? Like I said, we prioritize students if there's Erica, how about you?
So thank you so much for all of your responses. They were all really interesting. And I had a
Here, wait a second. I'm actually going to give you this.
thanks. So I had a question about like the patriotism piece and how some people have been saying that maybe a national service program would be really good for kind of creating this social cohesion. So what do you think of that type of solution?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I will apologize for not going into more detail when I say things that may be provocative, but just in the interest of time. So yes, so I'm biased because of the military. I met folks in the military, deployed with folks that I never would have met otherwise, and so I have friends, legitimate friends that are Trump voters. Because we served in the military together, and we're not friends because we see the world the same. We're friends because like we were there, and like we genuinely care about one another. And so, what are the avenues we can create for more people to have those experiences? And a national service program would be useful there. The problem is, if you mandate it, there will be lots of folks that say that's a violation of my maybe just my First Amendment right. You're compelling me to do something, and we compel people to do selective service, and so we can mandate people do things. But I don't know many politicians that are willing to have that fight. And so, how can we incentivize it? Well, if we incentivize it financially, people that don't need the money, they don't show up. And so the incentivized national service program becomes a kind of scholarship program for working class kids who, come from families that don't have a lot of money or whatever. And so I don't know how we build a program of national service where it's not mandated and it's not incentivized in a way that would just exacerbate class inequalities. I'm a fan, and I would never say this in a room of sociologists. So but I'm going to say it here. There's a role for shame and stigma here. It's a powerful tool because in the wrong hands of the wrong person, you can do some very damaging things. But it used to be something when, if your family was the family who didn't send someone off to World War II, for example, there was a little bit of an ostracization that happened. Like, oh, my kid's sacrificing, and your kid's off. If they leave the country during Vietnam to go to Canada, there's this sense like you didn't put in on this. And so that is something you can't buy, sort of status. And so if there's a status connected to those who serve the country, not for monetary gain, not because it's going to help their resume, but because they are genuinely invested in getting to know people that are not like them and be of service, I would love that program, and I think it would do wonders for the country. I don't know how to make that happen in a politically feasible way.
Thank you. Next, so yeah, I know we've got some over here though too. So I want to sort of go be even. How about Aubrey? Here, I'm gonna give this to you.
Okay, so I was just wondering, how do you think the Democratic Party can make themselves more appealing to the Black voter again?
Yeah. So look, there's this. So Paul Freimer is a scholar at Princeton, and a couple decades ago, he wrote a book. The title is escaping me now. But he writes about this concept called electoral capture, and it's the idea that in a polarized two-party system, for some groups there is a party that has won that group over, and then there's a party that isn't interested in winning and isn't interested in that group because the cost to try to win them away from the party they vote for is too high. And so the result of that is you get a party that doesn't try to win the group compared to against a party where the group has been long voters of them, and so they don't have to try as hard. I don't think I don't think the Democratic Party, frankly, has to do much to keep its standing with 90% of Black voters, because the options for most Black voters are just untenable. And so the choice isn't whether the Republicans will win them away, it's whether they show up to vote at all. So for the Democratic Party, when it comes to Black voters, it's a question of turnout more than it is trying to attract them through policy prescriptions. And so and you'll see it all the time. The Democratic Party, in fact, when Biden first came into office and there was a Democratic House and Senate, they tried to get through H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which became the maybe it was Freedom to Vote Act, which then became For the People, or vice versa. But it was basically a democracy wish list to drive up voter participation. It almost solely that, because in the sort of Democratic strategist thinking, the more people that vote, the more likely it is that Democrats will win. So Democrats see democracy, but structurally today, as mostly a voter participation fight. And so in that sort of framework, you don't have to do much to win people over. You just have to get more of your folks to the polls than the other side. I think, and I've said this for 10 years, and I actually wrote a cover story for the National Review in October of 15. Here's how Republicans can win Black voters. Not because I'm conservative, not because I'm a Republican, but because I believe that when there is competition for an electorate, that electorate is better served. And when there's no competition for that electorate is not better served. So a 90% of Black folks, when we know that there's tremendous political diversity, are voting for one party. I don't think Black Americans are helped. And I would say the same for Hispanic Americans, white Americans, like you name it. I want party competition. And there's, frankly, I think Republicans just haven't shown much sustained, earnest interest in doing what it takes to win over Black voters. And so because of that, I think Democrats haven't had to try very hard to win over on policy, only on participation.
So I'm sorry, Katie, but I'm gonna call on Matt to get some gender diversity here. Here you go. Here you go.
My question was, given all the barriers in like voting, like institutional barriers that exist, and things that happen, like what happened with Crystal Mason, what do you think is the quickest and most efficient way we can go about mitigating these threats in a purely policy-oriented kind of viewpoint?
Oh wow! I had an answer for the quickest, and then you said policy, and now it's our quick. Yeah. No. So I'll say twofold very quickly. The quickest way, not the easiest, but quickest, is to mobilize people. Usually, the bills that are passed that make it more difficult for some folks to vote are today surmountable if people are aware of what those hurdles are. And so a lot of folks that, on the left, there's an argument that lots of states have passed voter suppression bills, things that remove people from voter rolls, close polling areas that make lines very long, make it a crime in Georgia to pass out water to people waiting in line, like that kind of stuff. And that's real, but they will say, but look, all of those things have been put in place, and voter and Black turnout has gone up over the last 2 or 3 presidential elections, and it's because voters have been trained and mobilized on what the new laws and restrictions are. Folks like Stacey Abrams and NAA, like all the folks we see in the news that are just trying to get more people to the polls. So that's the quickest way to overcome some of these laws, but it's not sustainable. Because you have to raise lots of money, you have to keep people engaged. Structurally, I would love to see the sort of eradication of gerrymandering through the adaptation of like data science, frankly, to determine how to make every district competitive. My colleague at New America, Lee Drutman, who's been here, has talked, I think this coming up election cycle, something like of the 435 seats in the House, only 25 are competitive. Everything else is basically whoever wins the primary and the Republican side or the Democratic side, depending on the district, wins the general. So the primary is the election. That's no way to run a democracy. A couple of scholars in Wisconsin came up with the efficiency gap as a way of measuring the mathematical closeness or distance between of polarization. Of how many votes are wasted in gerrymandered districts. So that's one way. I'm not a fan of the Electoral College. But I know that's probably not going anywhere soon. And so just making the Electoral College votes instead of winner take all by state, making them proportional. Nebraska and Maine already divide up their electoral. So you don't even need a constitutional amendment to do this. You just need states to sort of agree, we're going to do a proportional vote based on the popular vote in our state to divvy up Electoral College votes. I think that would be useful. There's lots of things around like money in politics and the role of advertising and, can you lie in a political ad? The Supreme Court says yes, and folks say that's damaging. So there are all these little tweaks, but sort of going back to my main point, let's say we make these tweaks, people will find a way. They will find the loopholes. They will find the gaps. And so if we've got a frayed democratic culture, then the structural fixes aren't sticky enough to ensure we have a resilient democracy to resist to stand strong the next time someone tries to tear it apart. So the access, making it easier to vote in terms of registration and on the day of, and gerrymandering, and then how votes are counted, Electoral College winner takes all systems.
Thank you. Okay, Katie, your turn.
I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more about how like intersectionality of like Black people, especially like with like Black trans women as an especially like vulnerable category, kind of impacts this idea of like Black and racism in democracy.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'll tell you, I think. So look, I'm from North Carolina. My parents grew up the children of Jim Crow sharecroppers. So like this is. There's the conservatism, the religious angle, but also the sort of very progressive voting rights, racial justice piece. A lot of Black America isn't, based on just what I've seen, doesn't really know what to think yet about. And I mean, I think Black America in general is just getting its arms around um, the gender difference, like between men and women. And so adding more dimensions to that is beyond, I think, most Americans, but certainly most Black folks. So intersectionality for Black folks is usually muted again by the partisan behavior. But an example is so when in the 2000s, when same-sex marriage was still very much a national issue, patchworks of laws. In Hawaii it was okay, but in South Carolina it wasn't. As states started to pass laws that would permit it, Maryland was on that list, and it failed. And this was to allow same-sex marriage to go forward. And Black churches, I think, were 60-40 split, 60-40 against. Because the religious angle plus the conservatism angle, the sort of cultural conservatism, made them less welcoming to folks that sort of didn't fit the traditional, the sort of respectability politics frame of how folks need to behave in order to be welcomed. It's getting better a lot because the most energetic folks in democracy have always been young people. And so young folks have a better understanding of this intersectionality than the folks that have power in Black America, in the churches, in politics, financially. And so there's just a catch up that needs to happen politically across generations and across sort of worldview that hasn't yet taken hold. So the role of it in this election, or in elections generally, is very small in the generals, but you get more traces of it when there's a contested Democratic primary that's national. And that's why I think 2020 gave us a little bit of sense of that. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders talk differently about these things than Joe Biden or Michael Bloomberg, and they were all on the stage together. And that's where you started to see intersectionality within Black America break away from this 90% Democrat thing. Because I think in Michigan, Bernie Sanders got something like 30 or 40% of the Black vote. Out West, he did really well. And so younger Black folks are more progressive, more understanding of intersectionality and how to incorporate it than sort of the more traditional and older Black voters, frankly, that elected Biden, the ones that saved his president, or his primary campaign in South Carolina, and then that's sort of the wheels turning.
And
So I hope that sort of
despite that, we got to remember Biden was for gay marriage before Obama was.
Yes, and you know why? The Black church. So like Obama in 2008, he was like, I'm not there yet on same-sex marriage. 2012, I'm not there yet. He wins re-election. 2014, I've had a change of heart. There's no more, and I don't know him, but I've met the guy. I think he was earnest, but he was a good politician, and he recognized that there were just some things that if he were to come out for or against during elections, he might hurt his ability to pull that coalition together that would help him win.
It's like one or two more. You've waited patiently.
Thank you. What would you say to a voter who is non-motivated despite it not being in their best interest? They don't like their party's candidate, so they'd sit it out despite the other candidate being objectively worse for their interests.
Yeah, that's a hard case to make. The Knight Foundation did a study of the 100 million, I think they call it, or something like that. But it's basically the 100 million people who don't vote in presidential elections, and ask them why. And it's basically, the systems don't work, we don't trust the people, and we don't think our vote counts. And I don't know the argument that would get a person who believes those three things off the sidelines. Like, I could say, well, that candidate is like really, really bad. Isn't that enough? And they would say, well, yeah, I remember the last time that party was in power and my life was about like it is now. And so, I can't. So here's what I do, and it's probably not the best answer, but I think about all the folks that couldn't vote, that died to be able to, and what is my responsibility to them? And this is not like a moral compass that I was born with. I wasn't a voter until I was 33. I joined the military right out of college. Right from college to officer candidate school, didn't vote. In 2000, 2004, finally voted in 2008 because I felt like, wow, this guy, I don't want to be the one that didn't vote for the first Black president. So I was 33 years old, and it was the person that sort of the moment in history that got me off the sidelines. And then once I was off, I thought, like, what have I been doing? I've been wasting, like, literally, people died for this right. And so who am I to, and this works both ways, both for how I think about racial justice, but also how I think about patriotism. I think about folks like Jehu Grant, and I can't hate I can't hate. I'm just sorry. I can't hate the United States. I can't hate America. I am optimistic. I am hopeful, and I can't help it. That doesn't always mean I've been engaged, because I also believed doesn't matter. And look, I'm in the military. I'm doing my part. Just because I don't vote doesn't mean I don't have any skin in the game. So for folks that would sit on the sidelines, I would say, do you realize what you're squandering? Do you realize the privilege that you have to exercise this right? Um, when you come from people, and all of us in here come from people who once weren't allowed to vote, we can't let that. We just can't let it go.
In short, social shaming.
Social
What you said
shaming,
before.
or historical shaming. Looking at
Historical
your
shaming,
your
The
forebear.
key is shame.
That's
Right. That's
right.
that's the takeaway. The power of shame. Okay. Last question, Eddie.
Hi, just would like to say thank you for coming to speak with us tonight. What would you say is the role that education should play in tackling polarization within the United States and racial tensions?
Yeah. So education, and so I think of it, education, especially K through 12, and universities, and to include community colleges, like the whole nine. There is a civic education piece. It's important that we know how many branches of government there are and that sort of stuff, but civic education stops there too often, and that's not nearly far enough. To me, the greatest benefit is the exposure to people that are different from you. And so when we have an educational system that is highly segregated by race and class, we are squandering the biggest opportunity of schooling, which is to learn beside people who are different from you. And the material is important, and we will fight over material and the CRT laws and banned books, all that stuff. We can fight over curriculum all day long because it's concrete and discrete and easy to battle. This book yes, this book no. But who is your kid learning beside is, to me, more important than what it is they're learning. The fight for integration, desegregation of schools wasn't just about resources. It was a recognition that we can't make it in this country if we're put in the corner. We have to be beside the people we share the country with in order to learn how to do it here. So from that, to me, is the biggest role education can play. And to the extent we can facilitate diverse student bodies that look like America, both by class and region, and that's why national service, I think, it sort of extends the promise there. That is its greatest role. But I absolutely recognize like the power of the material itself. Here's what I'll say on this. The last thing: there's a group, a nonprofit called More in Common. I'm on the board of its U.S. department or its chapter, and what they found was that when you ask Democrats and Republicans about what their kids should be learning in school, the vast majority, 3/4, want their kids to learn about slavery and Black history and Rosa Parks and all that stuff. Where the difference is who is to blame for all the bad stuff that happened. And conflict entrepreneurs, this is Amanda Ripley's term, these are folks that say, the blame game is how we divide people. And so if we talk about slavery, that's fine. But if you talk about who were the slave owners and who were the enslaved, well, now you're making one set of kids feel like victims and the other set of kids feel like the bad guys, and we can't have that, so don't talk about it. And it's much better to learn about slavery alongside the people who descend from folks across the spectrum of where they fit in society than it is to just say we're not going to talk about it because it's too difficult. Because then when the issue is raised, it's by people who don't have the nation's best interest at heart, or they're at times where people have already fixed their views, and now it's really hard to move them off that point. I think, again, national service can be useful here, but I'll say this. I was in the military with these folks, like the exposure that you get, that I want our school systems to get. But what research shows is when you take people out of that environment, the gains that they get from exposure aren't necessarily sticky, that there's a radius and a half-life to the exposure. And so what we found, or actually what they found in the military post-World War II, was that as folks left that worked in integrated units or exposure to integrated units, when they returned to their hometowns after 18 months, 2 years, whatever moderated views they held on race or people from certain states, whatever, those fell away. and they readopted the views of their hometown because the exposure had sort of worn off. And so there is no silver bullet for how to do this stuff. You have to get folks at every step of sort of this relentless, you're not here alone. It ain't just you and your folks. It has to be all of us in it together. And so I've taken to calling it silver buckshot. You got to hit people like a whole bunch of times in a whole lot of places over the course of their life in order for it to stick, because there is no one bullet that's going to win the day. And so that's what I think the role of education is to begin life in this country, expose the people who are different from you, so that that becomes the norm, and understanding that you are not in this alone, and you can't just worry about folks that are like you.
Silver buckshot. That's great. Okay, we'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.